Going to start recording. So, okay, so now it's recording. Um, so welcome everybody. I wanted to do this. Um, I guess this best practices. We did this at HEC. It's a conference in Indiana in November, um, and I think it was helpful there. Um, there's a lot of times, folks run FileWave for a while, and there's maybe some things to think about in keeping your server healthy and happy. And so the goal of this is really to kind of talk through things to consider in keeping your server healthy and happy. So let's go to here. So this has, I have a series of slides just to remember that all the things to talk about. But um, for instance, the TCP and UDP port usage, mostly really TCP ports, but um, you should think about if we've introduced new ports. So with 14.8, we started to go from 0MQ over to NATs. And just the thing to know about is it uses different ports. If you go to the KB and you look at the TCP and UDP port usage, let me bring up that as well. So let's talk about this. So when I come here, right, to the KB and I go to the default TCP usage, we'll label things. We try and make it, visible about what is coming and going. And unfortunately, moving from 0MQ to NATs, they essentially accomplish the same thing, but it was kind of a necessary move for us. That's the thing that does notifications. But if you don't adjust your firewall ports so that you can, reach your server on the NATs ports, then one thing that you'll experience is when you're in the FileWave admin and you move something or create a file set, you're going to see that your admin just doesn't reflect that you've made changes. You'll see that when you're in your admin and you do something like create an association, that association doesn't appear for you. And then you quit out, you come back in, and then suddenly it does. You may also see, instead of everything is okay, notifications may be a red dot. So when I see that, I mean, unless you're experiencing, just a bug that we have to work through with support. But if you go to 14.8 or 14.9.2 or 14.10, from an older version, this notifications is super important, and so we did make that change. So you have to think about that. I can tell you that for the next version, for 14.10, that's coming out probably in about a month, that is there's, I believe, two ports that'll be added here. And we do the release notes and the announcement. We try and call out when that happens. So when you get the email about a new release, or in the KB, when you look at release notes. So if I go to FileWave release notes and I check out 14.9, we will have sort of, a notification. When you see this wording, I need to check out if there's changes. And then we try and make it so in the article it's kind of obvious about the changes. Okay. So the ports changing is important to open those ports, but the other side of the coin is when we moved from 0MQ to NATs for client notifications in 14.9.2, well, in all the 14.9 releases, but when we switched over, that means that if you have a client that's running 14.7 or 14.6, it doesn't know about NATs. It doesn't have NATs. So its sort of real-time notifications aren't going to happen. So you have to think about if your clients are not upgraded, then that could be an issue. If you're seeing things not happen the way they should, you should think about what version is that client on, and maybe that is a factor. The 0MQ to NATs was pretty significant. We hope not to make such major changes in the future, But that's one where it really can affect the, how a client can talk to the server. Okay, so that one's an important one, right? Then there's the whole physical versus hosted and virtual machine. So you could run a virtual machine on premise yourself. You could run a physical server on premise yourself, or you can do hosted with us. So a lot of people don't yet know that we do hosted, but essentially for hosted, we run usually in Amazon Web Services, but we're also doing things with Oracle Cloud. Um, we'll run the server for you. We'll handle upgrading the OS of the server. The only thing you really have to do is upgrade your admins and your clients and your boosters. But otherwise, we'll take care of the server itself. Um, it also makes it easier to troubleshoot. Um, we don't really charge a lot for hosting. We actually charge just about what it costs. I mean, so you may find that it's actually cheaper to run a hosted server than to run it yourself. And if you don't necessarily have the expertise to run the server, then it kind of puts it on us to take care of it, right? So that can be a pro. The the reason why you would definitely want on-premise is if you do Windows imaging. We can't do Windows imaging with a hosted server right now, but we're actually in the midst. We're about two-thirds done with the changes required to make it so a hosted server could handle Windows imaging just fine. And the consideration is a Windows image, let's say it's 20 gigs to 60 gigs in size. That's a lot of data to be moving from AWS or Oracle, from your network to the server and back. So some of the changes we're doing are to make it so that a local IVS or booster could handle that image and maybe not the server itself, so that we don't have to move that image out your internet gateway and back through. So for Windows imaging, which is really sort of the last thing that would block you from hosted, that is in the midst of getting addressed. Uh, but you can run these kind of three ways, and as well, if you run it on premise, if you have virtual infrastructure, you know you can probably run a more beefed up server. You could choose to throw a ton of RAM at it, throw solid state drives at it. You can do whatever you want. So on premise does have the attractiveness of being able to tweak the hardware if you want. Um, with us, if you have hosted and you're seeing performance issues, definitely let us know, because we do have different tiers with Amazon, and we can perhaps adjust things. So don't feel like if you're hosted and your server's not performing how you'd like, don't feel like you're kind of stuck with it behaving that way. Um, Definitely open up a support ticket and bring up any performance issues. Some of the performance issues, no matter where you're running your server, can be from some of the other things I'm going to talk about in this session. And feel free to, by the way, interrupt and ask a question. It's totally okay. Um, but for instance, everybody probably knows that we do a tickle every 2 minutes. Mac and Windows clients in particular will reach out and try and say, hey, do you have anything for me? Well, that tickle of 2 minutes, if you have 40,000 clients, maybe you don't want it to be 2 minutes. Maybe you want it to be 5 minutes or 20 minutes, because that tickle time is really like, how, I guess, how quickly do you want a client to become aware that something is there for them? Um, and, general day to day, when you're not testing something, whenever I'm testing something, I'm rushing, I'm trying to force it along. But in your day to day, 20 minutes might be fine. And you can always hit the verify button and force a client to come in. So you might think about this, for your environment. Think about, is that 2 minute tickle time something that is burdening your server, needlessly burdening it, and at the same time, don't make it some giant number like 2 hours, because there are changes that you do want to see happen. Maybe it's 10 minutes, maybe it's 15 minutes. Think about what it is for you, and you can make that change using something called a super pref. And in the KB There are articles that talk about superprefs, and if you get stuck, you can ask, here in Discord, or you can open a support case to ask about superprefs. But a superpref is a way to push out a preference file to define things like what boosters a client goes to, what the tickle time is, whether booster routing is enabled, um, and you can also change the password to manage client preferences through that as well. So if you have never used a superpref before, then your client management password, the password where you can change the preferences for a FileWave client, and previously it was the VNC password, um, that is probably the same as it was on day one. And if you have had staff that left and new staff that came on, it's probably not great to have that same password for a long time. So a superpref can push out a new password, for instance. So you should take a look at the articles about superprefs and think about maybe taking advantage of that for the password, for the tickle, maybe think about boosters. Um, I would say that everybody who has 2,000 or more Windows and Mac systems should really think about a booster. Even in smaller environments, you might want to think about a booster, because a booster handles a couple of things, but it handles the file sets, handing them out to clients, to Mac and Windows systems. Um, let's say I'm pushing Photoshop out, and in my organization, I have a very large art department, right? Whether that be a school or a corporation. There's a very large group. I'm going to send Photoshop out to like 400 devices. Photoshop is kind of large, right? And so if I push it out without any boosters, the server is going to be handing out all those files. And if you're hosted, the server is handing out those files over the internet to your clients that are potentially inside your LAN. So a booster would let you put something in your LAN that would handle the distribution of those files, you know, and you can assign different boosters to different machines. You can have backup boosters. There's a bunch of KB articles about boosters. You should definitely think about it. I know there's some other slides that I'll bring up boosters again, but you know, it's just something to think about. Okay, so enough on that one. So this one, this slide was important because, um, and I had this little thing animated. I didn't make it play. Here we go. So if you've never terminaled into your server and you run your FileWave server yourself, and if you've never connected to your boosters, you've never connected to your IVS server, and you've never done yum update and seen sort of this dialogue the way this is showing, then you really want to think about that, because the appliances that we provide are full Linux hosts. They're running CentOS. Their OS needs to get updates. And there's a very simple command, yum space update, that will do the updates. And if you don't do these updates, what we've actually seen is, well, one, your system could get compromised, right? Because you're not doing security updates. We do them on hosted servers. And then the other thing is performance. There are updates to the Linux kernel that better handles traffic. We've seen people with IVS servers that misbehaved for Windows imaging. We did the yum updates, applied some kernel updates that had released a while ago, and then suddenly everything was happy. So the OS, it's really important to think about, are you updating the OS? And again, if you're not sure, if you need help to go through this, support, or here in Discord, you can ask about it, and there will be an answer quick about updating the OSs. If you have a booster that's running on Windows or on Mac OS, important that you patch those. Of course, it's like anything else. Patch everything in your environment, but people forget to patch the OS that runs on FileWave, because you might think of the appliance as a dumb appliance that you don't have to do anything with, and you absolutely have to make sure the OS gets updated. Um, and there's some steps in setting things up where you change passwords, like the configuration password for a booster or the root password in the appliance. And you should definitely do those things. It's spelled out in the KB articles. And if you're not sure and you're feeling like things might be insecure, ask support or ask in one of the Discord channels. There's a Discord channel about Linux. Um, you can ask there. There's one about boosters. Um, People get confused with the
I
number of
cut in here for
channels.
a second.
Of course.
Since we're talking about the operating system that the FileWave is running on in the virtual appliance, I was wondering, since it's running CentOS 7, I think, is there any
Yes,
consideration to move away from that in the near future?
there is. And it's a good thing that we have a plan because next summer, summer 2024, CentOS 7 is end of life. CentOS 8
Yeah.
is already end of life, but 7 was kind of the longer term release. That's why we picked it when we did. Um, so, I mean, I'll share our plan because it definitely is our plan. Um, we're going to Alma Linux. If you look up Alma Linux, it's binary compatible with CentOS 8, which makes it very close to the CentOS 7 that we use today. Um, so we believe, and we're working on documentation at this point. Um, we also, I got an update that we have FileWave running on Alma Linux. So the idea would be your existing CentOS 7 devices could update to CentOS 8, which is just there's a command to switch over and make it believe it's CentOS 8. And then there's a migration script from Alma Linux to turn a CentOS 8 box into an Alma Linux box. And we're going to produce documentation and a simple script that will do it. For our hosted customers, we're obviously going to run that and migrate the servers. But for on-premise, we're going to provide you with the steps to do. We're going to make it as simple as possible. And obviously back up before you do the migration. But our plan is to announce this summer the documentation and everything so that the goal is that you'd have 12 full months to do the migration and that the migration would be an in place migration so that you just choose when you want to run the scripts, do it on a weekend when things aren't busy, and it shouldn't take more than a couple of hours for it to complete in total. It should only take about 10 minutes of your actual time, to pick to run the script. And then you'd be running Alma Linux. And Alma Linux, we're then going to be able to support. We also have a plan that's been ongoing to become more of a real, I'll say a real SaaS product, because even if you're hosted with us, it's still a virtual machine. It's very much the same as if you ran it yourself. It's just we're managing it. But we are working on, turning the product into more of like a, expandable Kubernetes, it can grow however, um, and that solution, will obviously be running on something else. It may or may not be have any relation to Alma Linux, but you won't have to think about that probably because that SaaS product will be entirely managed by us. But does that answer the question?
Yeah, of course. Great to hear that you got that in front of you, and I'm excited to see how the migration will go.
Yeah, me too. I'm on the team that's making the documentation, so uh, I have to actually put that together. So we'll share it. Like the minute that we feel like the process is good, we'll share the documentation so that um, and we'll be transparent about the state of it. So if somebody wants to experiment and let us know how it went, we'll kind of have like a early adopter kind of thing where that it's not fully vetted and you do not run it on your production system, but you maybe try it on a test system, and then we'll have a version of it that we say this is fully vetted. You can trust this. Um, okay, so the server, the boosters, the IVS, you know, clients are here on this page too because, like I said, FileWave clients, you got to make sure that you're doing the client upgrades, whether you're on premise or hosted. And we made a couple of KB articles recently that I'll show off. And by the way, if you're ever unsure about what's changed in the KB, because it is kind of coming in constantly, um, in Discord, there's a knowledge base channel, and I have a bot that posts whenever a new article is posted. Um, You can also see recently updated here on the KB. Um, and we made an article about if your server was updated. Let's see. Oh, there we go. So this article was for hosted customers. There's another one that is upgrading your FileWave server. This one is for on-premise, right? Because there's more steps. You have to actually upgrade your server. Um, but this one takes it from the perspective of the server was upgraded. I need to do these things. Whenever we have a new release, if you're hosted, you'll want to look at this article and do these things. And if you're on premise, when you're going to do the upgrade, you'll want to just check this article to make sure that you're doing all the things you should with a new version. Okay. Backups. So backups are super important. If you're hosted, we back up your FileWave server. You don't really have to worry about backing up boosters because boosters just cache everything from the server, right? But a FileWave server for sure have backups. And if you're hosted, we're doing that for you. If you're on premise, we have a backup script that's in the KB. And that is, in fact, it's referenced here in this backup your server. Like we talk about this, and there's a link to the backup script. So if you're on premise, think about this step and either use our backup script or do snapshots on the VM. Um, there are some people that worry that um, when you do a backup, that hold on one sec. Let me just make sure something's not alerting. Sorry about that. Um, ignore. I think if you got a warning, if anyone experienced a warning from something called Wick on the Discord, ignore that warning for the minute. I'm going to take a look at that and see why it warned you. We have some automatic stuff, and I have to just make sure that I don't have something inappropriately warning you. So if you did get warned, ignore that. But, oh yeah, excessive bad words. Yeah, ignore that. I'm going to tweak that because nobody actually used bad words. So let's talk about, yeah, the backup. If FileWave server is running, snapshot backup, it may capture it just at like sort of the imperfect moment, depending on how the database was committing things, that it's not like a perfect backup. Now, in reality, I've never experienced the snapshot backup of a VM not working, but I guess there's a theoretical problem. So you may want to, on your on-premise server, you may want to have a process where every Saturday night at midnight your time, maybe use FW control to stop the server, the snapshot executes, and then FW control starts up the server after whatever amount of time you know the snapshot takes. So it's something to think about. You may want to periodically just have a backup that's done with the database stopped because, and definitely when you're upgrading, we say make sure you have a backup with that was done with things stopped so that nothing's really changing in the database as it happens. But it's sort of a theoretical problem. Um, I just have to mention it. Um, there is disk space. So when you are, in your FileWave admin and you're looking at disk space, and you may see that this is, much more full and red. If you're hosted, you need us to expand your disk space potentially. If you're on-prem, you have to think about how much disk space you have. But definitely think about purging unused file sets and images because they're gobbling up um, they're gobbling up disk space. And if you do Windows or Mac OS patching, and there are file sets for the many, many patches that come out. I mean, Windows for January, Patch Tuesday was incredibly large. And so those updates, you'll push them out, and then they're not really relevant after a period of time, right? Like there comes a time that everybody's patched, your image is patched, The new cumulative updates for February, March, April replace the ones from January. Um, so I say maybe every 6 months to a year, just do a quick review of what file sets you have, what images you have there. Are they still needed? Um, Nice thing, at least for Windows OS updates, is a lot of them will have the year in the name, so it can be quite easy. The other nice thing about OS updates in general is you could just decide once a year that you're just going to flush the whole thing. You're going to delete all the updates for OSs because if a client is reporting it needs it, you'll be able to re-add it. So there's no real loss. It's just maybe it's a little bit burdensome to recreate a whole bunch of updates, but flush those out because I've seen a lot of servers where they're filled up with a lot of OS updates and updates from years ago that wouldn't really apply. And for instance, if you go from, let's say all your machines are on Ventura and Monterey for Mac OS, well, do you really need a Catalina update in there? Probably not. So that could also be a way to think about flushing things out. Think about applications that don't work on like on Mac OS Cocktail, for instance. They make a version for every generation of Mac OS, right? So if I have Cocktail for Catalina, but I have no Catalina machines, I may want to delete that file set. And when you're purging things out to save space in FileWave, think about you may want to preserve certain file sets because you did something with a script that was really creative. And so maybe you want to keep it for that reason so that you have it for reference. You could also export it, save it somewhere else, and delete it from FileWave itself because you could always bring it back in if needed. Okay. So I don't know if everybody knows this. I run into a lot of people that don't. But the dashboard that's in FileWave Central or the native admin um, can reveal, what's working well or not working well. And there's a way to set up to get emails about alerts. And I think I have that here. Okay, let me talk about this first and then we'll talk about how you actually get it, right? So here's mine. Mine's all green. That's great. You can see things like when things occurred. So, if you see, the VPP last updated days and days ago, then that's problematic. I want to point out one of these where it says my smart group count updated 18 days ago. I have found that in particular this one, and if you look in the web admin, you'll see that it goes red quite quickly. This smart group count is the number of devices that are in smart groups when that last changed. And my lab is pretty quiet, so this is not a problem in my case. In a real server, if you're using smart groups for things and you're enrolling devices here and there, this probably will never be 18 days old. And if it was, then you'd start to think, well, maybe that's a problem. But in a very quiet lab that only has a certain number of devices, it's possible that the smart group count would, sit like this. It's not like a health check that smart groups are working. It's more like when it's changed last. So that's an important consideration. And, you know, there's other, kind of metrics here that you can look through and try and find helpful things, counts of devices. Do I have more devices in here than I have licenses for? Because if that happens, then I will not be able to do model updates. So, depending on your licensing type, if you have like a site license, for instance, it's just a matter of reaching out to customer experience and bumping up your license. If you have if you don't have a site license, let's say you've just run up against, you've overinstalled, you need to do cleanup, but you're kind of stuck. We will give you licenses temporarily for like 30 days if you need to fix something. We can create extra licenses that have a 30-day life, and we'll give that to you so that you can resolve it. We don't want to charge you for licenses that you're not really going to use because that would be silly. So definitely reach out to us and ask. If you're up against the max, you can't update the model, and it makes it really hard for you to clean up, then will give you temporary licenses. Okay, so as far as getting these alerts, because I don't want to have to look at this to know, I'm going to go to alert settings, and I can have this go to a distribution list, or I can have it go to Josh Levitsky at FileWave.com, and I could say FileWave alert from server something Josh Lab. And then I'm going to pick what I want. I probably don't necessarily want to check all of these, because if I'm not doing Apple Classroom, for instance, that doesn't matter. But, things like disk space and RAM maxing out, is there an issue with my VPP tokens if I'm doing Mac OS and VPP? Is there an issue with DEP? If I have Chromebooks, or Android, is cloud messaging broken? So I'm going to pick the things that I care about. And then, I might put something in here to remind myself. So there's going to be sort of this generic message that comes out, but I'm going to say, if you are seeing this, the FileWave server sent this automatically. Check the dashboard in FileWave Central or anywhere. So the web, or the native or web. Um, and so I might save that, and it reminds you that these can only be sent if the outgoing mail server is defined, right? So if I just do this, it's not going to be able to tell me about these things. But if I go to preferences and I go to mail, you want to make sure that this is filled out. And if you're a G Suite, user, that your emails with Google, think about whether this user password is an application password. And we do have a KB article that talks about that. And you can send a test email and say, I want to send this to, whatever, and I'm going to send it to myself. The sender happens to be myself. And I'm going to see that was able to go in my mailbox. I'm going to get that email. So I'm going to know that this was able to be sent. So by doing that, I'm going to be able to know that these will go through. Okay. Think about that email sending account being a service account in particular. In my case, it's my own, because this is a lab and I experiment. But if I was like at a real, if I was at a company where I'm managing systems, then I'm probably making a service account for sending these emails. Okay. And so that's something to think about. That's this. This is that KB article. So no, sorry, this is nothing. That KB article I mentioned references this Google article. So in the KB, it talks about setting up mail. And actually, it's good that I have this as the next slide, because you can see smart groups is red. Smart groups, this is the web admin. This is really Grafana from the web admin. That smart groups will turn red if I think 10 minutes has gone by without smart groups changing. And I had mentioned to developments that seemed a little bit excessive, because even in a production environment, 10 minutes could go by without a smart group changing. We should probably make that, more like a couple of hours or something, or maybe even a day, or configurable. So, but in the web admin, there is this dashboard as well. It got significantly better in 14.9 releases, because we did major upgrades to Grafana. So you're going to see, if you were ever frustrated with Grafana in FileWave, you should not be frustrated anymore, hopefully, because we went to the latest version. It has a bunch of new changes. You can create metrics about your server. We're going to be doing a thing here on Discord to talk about getting started with your first dashboard in Discord in, I think it's 6 weeks from now. But that one too, we're going to try and record and post, so that somebody might be able to see it even if you can't catch it here in Discord. And that's another one we might end up repeating periodically through the year to get you started. You might be wondering, why would I use Grafana? if you work in a physical building where you have a big monitor or monitors, or you have a network operations center, or some large school districts even have a network operations center where they're monitoring things. If you're using FileWave to take care of a big population of devices, and certainly corporations have network operation centers, or you may even just have a team room that everybody's in that has a big screen, you might have this showing up so that you can see at a glance, is FileWave okay? What's going on? And you can make custom dashboards. Like if you look in the Grafana channel here on Discord, I posted something that Emma made. It'll show you how many clients have checked in the past 24 hours or 30 days or whatever you want. Um, and Emma will probably use that example in her Grafana session here on Discord, um, because you can make the metrics whatever is helpful to you to know that FileWave is doing its job, or that something is really broken and you need to take an action. Okay, so let's see. So the SSL certificate, this one's easy. It's in preferences. Um, Everybody has an SSL certificate, whether it's self-signed or a FileWave one or your own. You want to consider, is it past its expiration date, right? Every SSL certificate has an expiration date. If your server is something.filewave.net, you don't have to worry about that. We change that. If it's anything else, you do have to worry about that. And I would say, for anyone that's using self-signed certificates, you want to think about maybe getting away from that. Like, the world, it's getting harder and harder to use self-signed. For instance, with Apple's VPP version 2, that we still haven't made the default. You can sort of make a server do it, but we're still on VPP version 1. With VPP 2, Apple actually tries to reach out to your server and talk to it, and it's not going to like a self-signed cert. And so that's going to be problematic. Um, if you're using your own certificate, then just look at the expiration date, put something on your calendar, remind yourself that you need to refresh this SSL cert. And if there's a KB article that's pretty easy that explains it, and support is there if you're stuck and just aren't quite sure what to do. Okay. If you are using self-signed certs because maybe you don't have the budget for real certificates, um, there are cheaper certificates out there. One of the bad things about cheaper certificates is that an operating system may not know about that certificate authority. And that is the same as a self-signed cert in a way, because if you have iOS devices that don't know about that certificate authority, they're not going to trust that certificate. You're going to think it should work, but it doesn't work, and so that's a consideration. But Let's Encrypt, which is a free certificate system, Let's Encrypt, for instance, is in most OSs. But if you go back to older versions of iOS, it definitely is not in there. So it's just something to think about. And if you do have legacy devices, that is one of the things that can happen. Is if you're running a version of Mac OS that is 8 years old on some old piece of hardware and you renew your GoDaddy certificate, you should keep in mind if that older device is going to be capable of trusting the GoDaddy certificate, or maybe you have to do something to push out um, that certificate authority to that device. And it's just like a thing to think about. If you keep your devices pretty current, the past couple of years, then you're going to be fine. But this can cause things to break, communication to break. Older devices that don't know about a certificate authority, and you use a certificate from an authority that isn't known to them. So, something to think about. Compatibility mode is mentioned here. Compatibility mode existed from before we had a whole thing with trusting certain certificates for communication. If you have it checked, this compatibility mode for versions older than FileWave 13.1, if you don't have FileWave 13.1 clients, you probably should not have this checked. You should, I would say, if you have this checked in preferences, open a support case and talk to support about just going through why do you have it support checked, and if it would be more secure to have it off, because the end goal is that it would be not selected for everybody. But I don't want to tell you to just go in and uncheck it, because I want you to make sure that you go through with support about why you have it checked to begin with. Okay. Okay. The next thing is APN certificates, right? So Apple push notification certificates needs to be updated. You need to put on your calendar to update this, before this expiration date comes. The other thing is, so this is for folks that are managing Apple devices, Apple TVs, iPads, iPhones, Mac OS devices that you're doing MDM enrollment. Um, you're going to make sure that this is updated. You're also going to make sure that you update it in the same exact account that you created it with. So there's this certificate, this value here, and it's going to match. Well, you're going to see the date that it was created. So I'll see that May 12th would be on that certificate. That would be a clue. And there'll be a thing, I think it's called a topic, that will match the same thing here. You want to make sure you use the same exact one, because if you change, let's say I go into a new Apple account, I make a new push certificate, your clients are going to not be able to do MDM commands with you because they don't know that new certificate. You don't want to actually change it to be a different certificate. You're going to be renewing the same certificate. So it's important to do that in the same Apple ID. If you're starting from scratch from day one, you want to have an Apple ID that's like a service account. If you've already started with FileWave and you already created your push notification certificate in your own personal Apple ID account, just know that you'll have to keep doing that forever unless you want to re-enroll all your devices. So that was actually an issue for me. I was guilty of that when I left where I managed devices at Time Warner. This was I don't know, about 10 years ago. And, originally when MDM first started, so I probably first started that more like 15 years ago, there wasn't a lot of guidance about doing the right thing and having service accounts. And so um, it, it was easy to make the mistake. I left Time Warner, and what I ended up doing was handing over my Apple account to them so that they wouldn't be stuck. Um, But, in a world where you buy personal things with maybe a personal Apple account, you definitely do not want to have it in a personal Apple account. You want to figure out how you're going to undo that. Um, so the same account always, ideally, an account controlled by the organization, so that when you leave, because ultimately, I mean, eventually everybody either retires or moves on or gets promoted, right? Something happens. So just be sure about this, because this is important. And be very careful when you're doing this update. And if you feel unsure, engage with support. Just ask the question. They'll help you to confirm that you're looking at the right certificate. Okay. The next thing is, when you're doing updates, and I apologize if this session runs longer than I originally thought. It actually probably will, but I'll have the whole thing recorded. So if anyone has to drop off, the recording should get posted. And if it doesn't post right, I will make a fresh recording that covers all these things and post it. So do not worry. Um, the other thing is, in preferences, um, if you're doing MDM for Mac OS, you probably, if you go into preferences and you go to the mobile Mac OS tab, you're going to see a version of FileWave. And my guess is, if you've not looked at this in a long time, you're going to see a really old version of FileWave. And what's going to happen is, when you enroll devices through Mac OS devices, they're going to get this agent. And if this agent is really old and your machine is brand new and it's an M1 or M2 processor, an Apple Silicon processor, well, Rosetta might not install. Things might be broken because it's such an old client. So when you do upgrades to FileWave, you're going to want to make sure you upgrade this client package as well. because you want to keep that. I mean, it doesn't have to be exact, but it would be the cleanest if it was exact. You definitely want to update it when you know that we change the client to be compatible with Ventura, for instance, because you're going to have Ventura machines. And you're probably going to want this checkbox, initial enrollment only, because if it's not checked, it potentially could push out that older one to an existing enrolled device. That wouldn't be ideal. So initial enrollment only, that way this can lag behind a version or two and not introduce a problem. And if you've never made a custom client, I just want to show you and kind of step through that pretty quick. And in those articles about upgrading your server, we do talk about this and give you this URL. So if you go to custom.filewave.com, you can make a Mac or Windows client, kind of the same thing no matter which way I go. You say what version you want it to be. There can be times when you know there's a bug in a particular version and you want to pick, maybe you didn't upgrade your server from 14.8 yet. You probably don't want to run 14.9.2 against the 14.8 server, so you can pick the version of client. I would put in the host name of my server, just like that, no HTTPS or anything. Don't mess with the ports unless you know that in your server environment you have specifically changed a port. Otherwise, leave the port numbers alone. The password. This is historically that VNC password, right? But VNC is gone in 14.8 and 14.9.2. It'll be still gone in 14.10. So this is when you go to look at a client and you're going to remotely set the preferences, this is going to configure it. You're going to, oh, and yes, a last sync attempt of 2 years seems not good, Sean. I see your comment there. That would be definitely worth perhaps raising a I mean, unless you don't use smart groups at all. So sorry to sidetrack on there. I saw the chat message, but if you didn't use smart groups like at all, then it might not change. But if you do and you're seeing 2 years, maybe open a support case and just walk through why that is with support. So um, so client password, right? That's going to be remotely setting preferences. Change this. I'm never a fan of default passwords being anywhere. So even if this was some random, number letter thing, change it and then copy this and put it in. I hope you're all using a password vault, um, either personally, something like 1Password. Um, I know that some of them have had issues lately, like I think LastPass had a compromise. Everything's ultimately going to get compromised. Kind of stinks, but having a password vault, I mean, 1Pass is nice because you can have a private vault on your system, but have a password vault, use unique passwords, have a way that someone could get access to the passwords if you leave the organization, or that you can share them as a team. 1Password has that advantage. You can have team vaults that are shared among multiple people. So something to think about. So I always change that. In here, tracking. If you track location of devices, you're going to want to probably check that so that it's actually collected. Um, Overwriting the configuration. If you're making the package that is going in for an initial DEP enrollment, this one doesn't matter because it's a DEP enrollment. It's a clean machine anyway. You probably don't want to check this unless you have an issue that your preferences on machines are in various states and you want to run the installer to kind of knock them all to the same kind of state. That's what this exists for. It kind of stomps on the config, and most people do not check this when they're generating this package. But if you are using it to have your technicians fix a problem, you might generate the package with this check because it would stomp on the prefs. Remote control enabled is for VNC in the past, but it's for TeamViewer now. We've changed the text to reflect that. This is if you could remote into the device. This is if you do remote in, would they get prompted for a connection or not? Server certificate, you only really need this if you do a self-signed certificate. It's because otherwise the client doesn't know if it can trust it, right? So for Mac or Windows, this makes it so that that's a non-issue. But like I said, if you can avoid self-signed certificates, probably avoid them. It's the world is moving away from really that being a trusted thing. Publish port, don't change its a port. Tickle interval. This is, if anyone doesn't know, every 2 minutes your clients will ping the server and say, hey, is there anything for me? Has anything changed? And then the server will issue something. If you think about it, in production environments, I bet you all have it set to 120. I can almost guarantee, unless you have seen this and have changed it. Um, think about that. Your server's getting just bombarded with these tickles. Um, maybe it should be 5 minutes or 300 seconds. Maybe it should be 10 minutes, because if you don't need something to just constantly be checked on every 2 minutes, there could be a reason to make it lighter. You would need less server resources. Your server would be more responsive. And at the end of the day, you can always click verify, and a verify will cause a client to check in right away. So, assuming it's powered on, but it can't do a tickle if it's not powered on anyway. So, think about raising this. And if you do raise this, don't just do it here, but you'll also want to push out a superpref to adjust your existing clients. Like I was talking about, there's an article about superprefs in the KB, and that way you can make it consistent. And later today, we're going to publish an article about setting boosters and the tickle timer through superprefs, and it has custom fields that let you easily see how everything's configured. So later today, that should post. Should see that in the KB. The VNC relay ports you can ignore for 14.8 and above. We just have it here in case somebody's building a client for an older version of server. Eventually, these will go away. And then booster settings. Like I said, you should really consider, should you have boosters. Even if you're a small environment, a booster still could have an advantage for you to help you with site-to-site bandwidth, perhaps. We have some articles in the KB about boosters and booster setup, but the idea is that there's sort of a list of boosters, and in the KB it'll talk about the ports for it, where it talks about the superpref. But if you had 5 boosters in here, what happens is the client will go for booster 1, and it will try about 30 times to hit it, and then it'll go to booster 2, 30 times, booster 3. So it'll work its way through. And then if it gets a booster it can talk to, it'll stay with that. And then after about an hour, it will try again to see, can I get to booster 1? Because maybe booster 1's not busy anymore. And so we try and help things stay healthy, but a booster and having failover boosters can be great. You can even get super complicated, and you can have a booster that talks to your FileWave server, and then you can have boosters that talk to that booster. So not that many people get that crazy with it, but you can architect something quite interesting with boosters. But if you don't have any boosters, you don't worry about that setting. You hit build, and build will spit out a download. I'll get it in a second. It'll say running, and then it'll give me a zip file. The zip file you're going to expand, whether it's Mac or Windows. And for Mac, you're going to get a PKG. For Windows, it's going to be an MSI. On Mac OS, we're going to notarize that installer because you guys know that's required. Sometimes when you download the PKG, it'll complain for maybe an hour or so after you've produced it, but then it'll be fine. It takes a moment or two, I guess, to do the back end stuff to talk to Apple. But when we go into FileWave Admin here, and we go to Preferences, and you go to Mobile, and we go to Mac OS, the upload client package is not the zip file. It's the package inside the zip file. And the same is true for Windows. It's not the zip file, it's the MSI. And so you'll pick the PKG, and when you pick it, it will take a moment and then it'll say updated. If you don't get a little pop-up that says it updated it, don't leave this dialog until it says that, because it will say it. If you leave the dialog before it says it was updated, then it won't really update it, and you'll realize that because you'll see the version won't update. Okay, so I think that kind of covers that, and Windows is on here too. It's the same idea. I don't have to go through building a custom client because same idea. For Windows, this is here only if you do Windows MDM. Windows MDM, you would know if you did it because you tied into Azure, and you would install FileWave by enrolling a device into Azure, and Azure would ask FileWave to install the FileWave agent, and it would be the agent that was set up here. And so if you don't do Windows MDM, ignore this. You don't have to do it. But if you do Windows MDM, you're going to think about um, updating this as well. Okay, VPP and DEP tokens. This one is important for Mac, for Apple TV, for iPads, iPhones. You're going to look at the last synchronization date, right? This is reflected on the dashboard too, like those green dashboard things, and you can get alerts when they're not good. So why would these stop working? Well, one of the reasons is when Apple releases a new version of Mac OS, well, they release new terms and conditions. And they'll send an email to the admins of your Apple School Manager or Apple Business Manager account and say, you need to accept the new terms. And until you do that, you are broken for DEP. VPP can break too because they'll release new terms and conditions. Um, so these can break outside of the date, the expiration date that you'll see when you do configure accounts. So if you're seeing it not sync, there's KB articles that will step you through this, and support is there if you need help to update them. They're super easy to update, both the VPP for the volume purchase of applications and the DEP for hardware to come into your FileWave server. They're easy to update, but they can break because Apple does that terms and conditions update. There are other reasons, like if you change the IP address that your server is hitting Apple from what I understand, that can invalidate your token too. So if you're not seeing a sync, the first thing you go for is update those tokens. Just go through that process. And this one, because it's in your Apple School or Apple Business Manager, it's less scary about, something being in a personal account. The Apple push notification stuff is done in an Apple developer account. A lot more likely that it's in a separated thing. This is done in ASM or ABM, so your chance of problems is low. So go through and update that if you're seeing a sync issue. This VPP2 only, where it's grayed out, this is a new version of VPP that we have still not made the default. This is the thing that I mentioned where like Apple actually reaches out to your server to kind of coordinate things. And we're still looking at, is this at the point where it's good enough on Apple's side where it's better than VPP1? And would it introduce problems for our customers that have self-signed certificates? So that is off by default. There is an article about it in the KB. It says that support can basically help you to enable it if you had interest in it. When troubleshooting, they might look at enabling it if it would solve a unique problem. So, okay. So performance and more. So let's talk about this. And we don't have that many slides, so anyone who's hung in there, it doesn't have much more, but some important things to think about. This is another thing in preferences, the inventory tab. You're going to want to think about the smart group refresh interval. And, for Sean and your question about the 2 years, one thing that you could try to do is you could try a manual refresh of smart groups from this button. And then what you'd want to see is, what is this interval set to for you? 10 minutes is the default. If you set this, like in my example, to 5 and you have a pretty big server, maybe it's getting choked up by it's trying to do a sync and 5 minutes is going by and now it's trying to do another sync, but the first one hasn't finished and it's kind of getting all tripped up over itself. I really don't like when this is lower than 10. I should say the FileWave server doesn't really like when it's lower than 10, but we do allow you to lower it. Like the tickle timer, Think about if maybe a bigger number is better. I just had a pretty busy server I was working with. We made it 15 minutes. Um, Now, that means that it'll take 15 minutes for smart groups to update. So if you set custom fields to cause actions to trigger, then you're a person that probably doesn't want to make it 15 minutes. You may probably have set the smart group refresh to 5 minutes or lower. Um, if you're realizing that you're seeing problems, make it a slightly higher number, see what happens, see if that's the contributing factor. But this will evaluate smart groups, and every time it does reevaluate smart groups, the server becomes very busy for however long it takes to do that. Um, and then it kind of becomes available again. So if I was to be able to set this to a minute, I never really tried to set it to a minute, but if I did that, that means that there is a portion of every minute that the server can't process anything, and that would be not great for performance. And these other values here about device inventory poll 24 hours, if you've ever wondered, like when we say things are collected every 24 hours, this is one of the things, and this is specifically for iOS. This is when we send out a push notification asking the devices to check in and let us know stuff. So this is variable too. So if, for instance, you're not happy with 24 hours, maybe you want it to be a little lower. But again, think about it that you're draining the battery of your iOS devices the more times you're hitting them. So if you had it set to 1 hour, every hour we're asking them to send their inventory in. That could be a little bit much for them. Okay, queries. This came up, and actually, maybe I'll pause just for a second. Any questions? Okay. Um, okay. So, queries. So you'll see these in FileWave Central, which is the native admin, or FileWave Anywhere, which is the web admin. You're probably really editing queries in Central because it's honestly much more powerful, and that's really our intent. Anywhere is intended for a technician role. They may be viewing a report, but they're not building a report necessarily out in the field. This is really going to be the place where you're authoring reports. And the important things are, have you ever noticed how some of your queries show up in the left sidebar with numbers, but then others you can click on, to see them? It's the little checkbox. The checkbox does more than simply have the device show up on the left. The queries on the left will be running. I think it's every 10 minutes. I could be wrong on the number, but they run when you first launch the admin. They run on an interval. The ones that you check the box for are the ones where you want to be able to glance over and see the number. You have a query about devices that have been seen in the last 24 hours. Maybe you want to know that number to see if it's dropped off significantly, or, what progress has happened with pushing out a profile to devices. How many devices have it? Maybe you want to see that. But there are a lot of queries that you don't necessarily want to see the number. You might even want to see the difference between Monterey and Big Sur counts, because inventory is big for you, and you want to see that, and that's perfectly fine. But a really complex query that, when you go into it, it takes like a minute for it to refresh. That is going to impact your use of the FileWave admin because your admin and every other admin is going to be processing that over and over, making your admin less responsive. So look for ones that have big numbers here. Like there was one with a customer I worked with this week where I think it was 500,000. There was a result. I think it was a big number. And it was clear that, for that thing that was being looked for, that was going to take a long time. So take a look at that, and the other thing is, if everybody knows the difference between a query and a smart group, and, why is one better than the other? When you are in the admin, let me bring it up, and I go here, if you've ever wondered about this ID number, right? Every smart group gets a unique number. Every clone in every device every clone for every device and every group gets a unique number. This number just moves up and up and up forever. We addressed an issue in, I believe, 14.8. We finally addressed it where you used to be able to run out of numbers. It had to get very big, but um, this number will just get bigger and bigger. For new objects, we don't really recycle the numbers yet. Um, in case there's like a reference to that number somewhere, we don't want to accidentally deploy something because we didn't, clean up. But the number will grow and grow and grow. And so if I make a smart group that is, devices that have called in the last 5 minutes, you can imagine there's constantly clones coming in and out of there. So that number is going up and up and up. And performance wise, that's not good because the server is having to process that smart group, constantly. The numbers going up and up and up, which is not helpful for it. Bigger numbers take more processing power. Um, so try not to think of using this for things that dynamically change all the time. Like you would use smart groups for things like what school is something assigned to, what department is something assigned to, is something with um, an IT person or sort of a non-IT person. What applications are assigned to devices, and you might even have a smart group that controls whether they end up in, getting that software. And those are all fine. It's mostly the ones that say, has it been seen in 5 minutes? The ones that'll just churn through numbers like mad, that you probably want to avoid. Um, Whereas queries, like they don't have that issue. You think about them more like reports that you're publishing. And I totally get why people tend to make client view, these smart groups more often, because my brain, this visually is very easy for me. I could have a building, I could have a department, you know, it's very easy. And you're using these for file set deployment. So, to want to live in here entirely makes sense. And the fact that you can customize the columns. But I'll just tell you the design of these is such that you don't want to do the thing that's going to just make number after number like mad, um, because of that reason and because of the server processing. You probably want to make it a query, and you probably don't want to make it a favorited query that shows up here. In general, you do want to make favorites of the ones that you really do care about. Like if I care about how many machines are on Windows 11, then I probably want that to be a favorite. Okay. So we talked about boosters early on, the importance of a booster. And this window here is the superpref editor. And you all have this on your machines. Wherever you've installed the FileWave admin, you have the superpref editor. It makes a file. The file is a preference file. And the same file works on Mac and Windows just the same. The only difference is, and you throw it in a file set, and it doesn't matter where in the file set it is, it will work on either. But one quirk is when you make a file set for Windows, Windows paths are different than Mac. So a lot of people do make a superpref for Windows and a superpref for Mac uh, file set, even if you reuse the same plist, because you want to choose where you want that plist to end up, and just have it be a place that exists in the platform you're sending it to. So in this example, I have booster routing enabled, which is super important because there's two things that boosters can do. There is file set boosting, and then there's routing server messages. And you want to check this box, and you want to have your list of boosters in the order that they would go to, where the first one is the one it tries to go to first before the server. The second one is the next one. You don't put the FileWave server in this list because that's just assumed. That's the one that it falls back to. Um, so that's how you configure this. Don't change the ports if they're blank. You'll see in our screenshots we show you the ports. Um, and yeah, and so you save this file, you shove it in a file set, it goes to your machines, and it will configure. Them. There is a KB article about it as well. Okay, so on the other side, there's configuring the boosters themselves. So there's a thing called Booster Monitor that's also on your machine if you have FileWave Central installed, right? Um, and this, I need to, to that. I'm going to make a live change. So I know beyond a doubt that in here, it only lets you pick a maximum of 400 connections for both macOS and Windows. And I didn't update this slide to correct it, so now that's true. CentOS can handle 2,000, and we will let you type in 2,000 for the connections. I'm currently in the midst of looking into if we really should allow macOS to handle more. I deeply believe it can. You can't do it in the UI, but I'm looking into with development if we can just change it in the plist file, and if it does support it, we should really make the UI able to pick it. And so think about these limits, because if you have, let's say you have 40,000 devices and you have two boosters. Well, they're going to, by default, if those two boosters are on Windows, they're going to handle 800 connections. That's not going to really help you much at all for your overall population. Everybody's going to be hitting the FileWave server. But, you know, 400 connections, when you put that at a office building or a school that has 400 computers, that's great. If the rest of your population is in other buildings, you set up boosters for those other buildings, you're fine. Um, but a lot of people don't think about that max connection thing and how it feeds into booster design. Because thinking about how many of your computers are typically online at a given time, and when you set up a CentOS booster, the number in here is still 400. You have to go in here and change it to a higher number. And you won't always want to pick 2,000. Sometimes you will want to pick a lower number because you're setting up for an office building, uh, you know, maybe two boosters that are going to do failover for each other. You have 2,000 clients that are generally online. Maybe each one you set to 1,000 so that they'll spill over from one to the other. Or maybe half your clients have booster one as their primary and half of them have booster two as their primary. So you can think about that and you can really make things work smoothly if you think about that. Um, there's also a checkbox here that's super important for boosters. Delete unused file sets. You probably want this checked because what this does is when you delete a file set from the FileWave server, it makes it delete it from your boosters. If you do not have this checked, they will be left behind on the boosters. And in general, for 99% of customers, you want those file sets cleaned up. Otherwise, your boosters are going to just grow and grow. And if it's a file set you've deleted, well, why do you need it on the booster necessarily? It doesn't really serve a purpose. So you might want to look at your booster settings and make sure that that's checked because you might have not checked it because you didn't know what it did originally. So just think about that. And this screenshot is older, so it looks a little different, but not much, like number of threads is gone. But the current KB article talks about the right fields. And I know I have to grab a new image for that. I've been refreshing that. Okay. Okay, cool. And Sean, that's good. I find a lot of people don't know because we don't spell it out. We're trying to overhaul the booster KB articles to make a lot more sense because they are very key to people who have Mac and Windows systems seeing better performance. Um, if you have, actually, an important point is if you have Mac, iPad, Apple TV, iPhone, you want to also think about if you have an Apple caching server. If you don't, you should really look up about an Apple caching server. In Discord, we have a chat that has some messages already talking about it, so you can ask questions there. Apple caching server is as simple as I can open my preferences on my machine. So I think this will get me there. So in Ventura, I don't know why they changed this, but I liked it the old way. But there is a content caching choice. So Okay. So it has options. So I could flip the toggle and turn it on. It has some very simple options by default. If you hold down the option key, you can see how this little advanced options appears versus regular options. So I can choose to cache all content. I probably don't want to share the internet connection. In options, I can say how big the cache size is. If my device was a dedicated caching server, potentially I want to share all the disk on it. But if it's doing other things like acting as a FileWave booster, then you're going to want to pick how much, right? You're going to want to pick what disk it's on. I'll show you if I hold down Option and go to Advanced, it's a lot more stuff. So by default, if you simply turn on caching server, it registers with Apple. Apple realizes from the public IP address that it came from, there's a caching server. When an iPad or a Mac or Apple TV goes to get an MDM update, right? It wants to get it from Apple. Even with FileWave, when you've assigned it from FileWave, MDM updates will come from Apple. So the device goes to Apple and says, "Hey, I want an update." And Apple says, "Hey, there's a caching server that's listening from the same subnet that you're on, or well, the same general public network that you're on. You should really go to that." And then your device will try and reach your caching server. If it can get the thing from the cache, great, it gets it. If the caching server doesn't have it, the caching server will ask Apple for it on your behalf, and then it will cache it. Um, and so, in the most basic config, where you don't go into advanced by holding down Option, um, it just registers the public IP address. So the way, if I turn this on now, anything in my house would go through me as a content caching server. But if you have a really complex network, you may want to say, I have a caching server for the physics building, or I have the content caching server for the bank branch that we have in New Jersey, and a different content caching server for the bank branch that we have in New York. Um, and so with these advanced settings, you can define a lot more about how it works. But a lot of people could get started with the very simple config, of just turning it on a device. Don't let that device fall asleep. I think they might prevent sleep when it turns it on, but I get really nervous, so I just make sure power settings, are set not to sleep on this device. And um, sometimes I'll use a thing like caffeinate, which, if you don't know, is a terminal command that keeps a Mac from sleeping. Um, Caffeinate is a helpful command in terminal. Um, but yeah, content caching is the other way to help things in your environment, because when you assign an MDM update to your iPad, we tell Apple, hey, this iPad should get this update. Um, Apple tells the iPad, hey, you're supposed to get this. The iPad then tries to fetch it from Apple, pulls it down and does the update. Then the iPad gives us through inventory whether it did it or not. And it's like a triangle of sorts, but it's very passing messages back and forth, and that's just Apple's framework. That's how it works. So we have to live within that. Every MDM does. So content caching will help with that, because it'll also help your internet connection. If you are a large business or school with a lot of Apple stuff, your internet gateway is slammed with content. 100 iPads all getting iOS 16.1 is big. But if they get one copy from the caching server, then that's just LAN traffic or WAN traffic. It's not your internet gateway. So a lot of plus. Okay. So file set organization, right? Since we've been talking about file sets and making things more efficient. Um, when we talk about file sets that are not MDM based, well, even the ones that are MDM based, because they show up here, Um, how do you organize? Do you just have all your stuff showing? You can see I have a bit of a mess, down here at the bottom. I try to encourage people, put all the VPP apps, in a group called macOS apps. Or I'll use a school example. Elementary school apps. Put them in an elementary school apps, especially if you're assigning all those apps to every device in the elementary school. because you can actually make an association of the group of apps rather than just the apps themselves. So I don't know that everybody knows this, but if I go to associations, you can see in my case, my iOS updates, which is all my iOS MDM updates for my iPads, really, it's assigned to a smart group for iOS devices. So everything that I create as a file set for iOS updates and put in my iOS updates folder ends up going to my iOS devices. So it's one association handling it. So, and you can see what that looks like here. So here you can see all these updates. Um, I think I was a little sloppy and I have some Big Sur ones in here, but sometimes I mess up my lab. But the important thing is, and and I guess another important thing is obviously Big Sur is not going to go to an iPad, even if I have an association. So that's not so much an issue. But it is good to break it up and, so that you visually, it makes cleanup easier, um, and it makes associating it easier. Um, and then my clients are all in this iOS section, and this iOS smart group is a very simple iOS device type equals any iOS device. So, and if you remember right, in preferences on the inventory tab, every 5 minutes on my lab server, I evaluate smart groups. So when a device enrolls, within 5 minutes, it hits this smart group, and then it gets the stuff that it's supposed to. And so that's where I would say the 10-minute evaluation of smart groups, you probably don't go below that generally because of server performance. My lab is tiny. Um, and you may make that number bigger, but if you did make it bigger, if my environment was a real environment, it would mean that I don't get these updates until 10 minutes into them coming into the server or 20 minutes into them coming to the server. So you want to think about that and cleaning up. And then the last slide before there's Q&A, and I'll hang out for a little bit to, if there's any questions, but custom fields. If you've not looked at custom fields, you can gather virtually anything. These couple of custom fields here at the top about boosters and debug level, that's the KB article that's going to appear today in the knowledge base that will help you with just easily seeing in a query what boosters are devices pointed at. Does it line up with what I believe I've done? We share this when we troubleshoot, but we never had it in a KB article, it seems like. With these, they can, on Mac and Windows, they can do things to the device. They can run as scripts, like it can be PowerShell on Windows, it can be Python on the Mac, it could be a shell script on the Mac. It's important when you pick a language for a script, like Python's a good example. Apple removed Python from Mac OS. So if you make a custom field and you pick that it's Python, make sure you have Python installed on the system. We use Python for FileWave, but we actually have sort of a copy of Python that we leverage, our own copy of Python that we leverage. So, when you're doing scripting, you probably want to think about using something like Brew to easily install Python, or look around. I think python.org has like a package that's, sort of the official package that you could push out. Or just stick to shell scripts and PowerShell, because every Mac can run like a ZSH script or a Bash script, and every Windows machine can run PowerShell, so you could stick to that. When you make these run every time a verify happens. So that means every 24 hours, or if you click verify, or at system boot. So think about how many of these fields you make, how busy they are, because they all will run, at least all the ones assigned to all devices. And generally, the ones that I make with people, we intend them to generally be assigned to all devices to either collect inventory or be what puts you in a smart group, um, to toggle that on and off. Um, think about how busy you're making the machines. So don't make something that grabs the entire FileWave client log and shoves it into this field, because that client log could be pretty big, and then if you have 10,000 machines, that's a lot of data, making your FileWave database very large. But if I wanted to get log information, maybe my script takes the last 20 lines of the FileWave log. Just think smartly when you make these about making them very good performance, very little data. Um, you can manipulate these through APIs to automate things. If you have a ticketing system like Incident IQ, they have a very nice included way of synchronizing fields between Incident IQ and us, so you can leverage it for all sorts of things. I said scripting is for Mac and Windows, but the other scripts, like to put devices in a smart group, you can use for iPads. You can use for Apple TVs. You can use it for everything except for Chromebooks because Chromebooks kind of live in their own little space. Um, so it's something to think about that you can use it for organization. And about a custom field being disabled without deleting it. So you could make it not assigned to all devices, and then you could pick all your devices. For instance, so if I wanted to be really sure, I would maybe uncheck in the custom field that it's not, assigned to all devices, and then maybe I go to, um, let's just say my organization. I have an easy way. I'm going to clear all filters. Let's say it was a field, that it was specifically for Windows devices, right? And I removed it from all devices, which, by the way, custom field, the same one could be both for Mac and for Windows. But in my example, I can edit custom field associations here, and I can choose. Now, the grayed out ones are assigned to everybody, so I can't choose to deselect it. But the ones that are not assigned to everybody, I can choose if they're assigned or not. So I could just pick them all and be here and just double check like, okay, it's not assigned to anybody. This is not grayed out. I know that it's not assigned to everybody. And the field still exists, it's just not assigned to anyone. And if I don't assign it to everyone, so you probably have test devices, you make a field, you don't assign it to everybody. You just go and you edit the association for your device. And then you test out how it works, and then you could assign it to everybody if you felt comfortable with it. Um, and if I go to custom fields, edit custom fields, it's this checkbox that makes it go to everybody or not to everybody. Okay, and let's see. So that is, and this was very long, so I will do a little QA. If you want to hang out for a little bit, I'll see what questions there are, answer them, and then we'll wrap up when it seems quiet. I actually don't know if I have anything coming up. Let me just make sure that I'm not ignoring somebody. So it is now 11:32. So I actually do have something, but let me message them really quick. Sorry about that. And this will be a little boring for a minute. And then I'll look at the questions. But you can dump questions in chat if you want while I'm doing this. Okay, so I sent that. Good. So at least that is covered so that I can kind of wrap this up on a good note. So is it bad that I have this many bad requests in the booster? So let's see. So there's lots of files boosted. So rejected client requests are when the booster is, hitting that max connection. Like I'm guessing your booster probably is set to 400 connections if you go to manage the settings for it. Um, so I guess it's not bad if you're okay that clients are probably failing to another booster or to the FileWave server itself. But if your intent was that they're getting everything from that booster, you want to think about um, if you want to change that setting. If it's a Mac or Windows system that's acting as a booster, you may not be able to raise that setting. So, should you add another booster? If it's a Linux one, you could raise it. So, I would probably do that. So, rejected ones are only bad if you didn't realize that it was kicking over so many connections to the next booster or to the FileWave server. So that's a a thing to look at. And let's see, I've got a customer that um, fire customer that fired, and its booster was not removed, so it keeps popping into my server. Possible to block it? Well, that's not a stupid question. That's a unique question. Um, that is so. Is your FileWave server hosted, or you run it yourself? Okay, so I mean, one easy cheat, obviously, is to put in the firewall rules to reject the IP address. I mean, if you're seeing the IP address, I mean but that's kind of taking it outside of FileWave doing it, right? Aside from the OS preventing it, um, that's a unique use case. I mean, it's totally valid. You might wonder why are they still continuing to run it because that's silliness. Definitely don't assign anything to it, right? Because shouldn't have any clients. Um, I would say maybe ping support to see if there's another. Uh, getting the IP address. Is it because? Oh, uh, so so then I would say ask support if there is a way to maybe blacklist it that I don't know of. There may be something in the config file, but it's not come up because you might imagine in most scenarios you control the FileWave server and the booster, so it's easy to decommission it. But you have a unique situation that's valid, but a little unique, and so I would have support probably answer that. Okay, so I see you typing. Otherwise, you may want to have a look at my comments about APNS above. Yeah, let me scroll back because there were some comments in here. Uh, let's see. I get all my certificates. Oh, okay, from SSL to buy and Alpha SSL, and you must use the same Apple ID. We talked about that, right? Um, Oh, okay. So I've never encountered, like, I've encountered the people that had the Apple ID in a personal one, but that's good to know that Apple does have a way that you could address it. Um, so that is good. So if anyone doesn't know, like, there's almost always like an Apple sales engineer or somebody that you reach out to if you buy any amount of Apple stuff. You may not have a dedicated person, but there's almost always somebody at Apple you can reach. And if you always do your stuff, let's say through CDW or some other reseller, and you really have no idea, who to ask, you could probably ask that reseller about it, and they might have a contact to put you in touch with. I think you can also open tickets through ASM and ABM. I think there's a contact info, but I forget. Uh, and the managed Apple ID, yes, is really nice, as you can change the phone number associated to the two-factor. Yep. Did I miss anything? And you could also unmute too if there was a bit that I was missing. Uh, we have a small group now. Let's see. Okay. Hey, no problem. No problem. So I guess if Sean or Trevor, if you had anything, otherwise I could wrap it up, and I'm going to see how the recording came out, and then I'll post it here in Discord, assuming it came out well. Okay, cool. Yeah, sorry as well that this took longer. Kind of the first one, so I kind of guessed how long it would take, and clearly it takes longer. So the next one I'll mark that it takes longer. So and more questions is good. So that's how you get better at this. So okay, great. So thanks everybody. So I will leave here, and but I'm always on Discord, so I'm always watching to see if I can be helpful. Okay, you as well. Everybody have a good weekend.